the problem with heart rate zone training, especially in the early days of the Polar watches. So I wanted to improve my running, and I began running at around age 11 or 12, I would say. And a few years in, I realized I somehow had to track things. And back then, GPS watches didn't really exist in a way, in an accessible way, similar to now. So I bought the Polar RS100 with a strap and also a watch. And this didn't track GPS, so I only could rely on steps. And it didn't even track steps, I think. It only tracked the heart rate, and that's about it. So Polar had this philosophy, or this advertisement, that if you trained within a certain heart rate zone, that you would train optimally. And I have to admit, I kind of believed it. And therefore, I bought the watch, and so basically, the statement was that the heart rate is the one thing that kind of indicates very well how capable you are of running faster or slower. So basically, how well trained you are. Nowadays, I think there are just many more variables, but back then, I didn't really understand that much. So I actually trained for a run. This was a kind of very steep run, so it was about 200 meters in elevation upwards, and whenever I would hit the recommended maximum heart rate, which was not my normal maximum heart rate, which was at the time around 200 maybe, 205, there is actually this formula. You take 220 and then you subtract your age, and that's probably your maximum heart rate. So at that time, my maximum heart rate was probably at around 205, 206, 207. Now I trained for this, and I stayed within these recommended zones that maxed out at 140, 145 probably, maybe 165. And I trained and I trained. And then the final race came, and I performed very badly. I was utterly disappointed, not to say. Apart from the fact that I had very serious side stitches that actually kind of meant that I couldn't really run anymore because it just hurt so much. It even hurt like 10 minutes or 15 minutes after the race actually finished. But what I took away from this after a few years of trying to train myself with this heart rate thing is, first of all, I got annoyed of the constant beeping of the watch. You could actually kind of turn it off, I guess, but at least in the beginning, every time you hit your recommended maximum heart rate, it would just beep all the time. And the second major problem is this: flexibility. If you train always within one certain zone, of course, you potentially improve your fat burning and also you running on fat. But what you don't really improve is you running at higher heart rates. And if you then do a race, and in the race you don't care about heart rate anymore because you actually just want to be as fast as possible, then you basically turn off the watch. And I didn't turn off the watch, but you just don't look at the watch anymore. And then you run at 190, 195, or 200 heart rate for 25 minutes. And what this kind of taught me is that these things are there. These things are maybe advertisements, and I shouldn't have taken it so seriously. I, for example, ran with friends in order to prepare for the competition, and my friends just could run at 180 heart rate, but I just couldn't because I wanted to train according to the best optimal training plan, which was maxing out at 160, 165 in heart rate. And I just couldn't run fast enough. I also didn't train fast enough. My training was basically a very low threshold training. Nowadays, there are many more heart rate zones. Actually, most fitness apps define 5 heart rate zones. There are anaerobic zones, anaerobic zones, aerobic zones, and anaerobic zones. Samsung Health, for example, just defines 5 different zones. And you should hit all the zones individually at some of the time. Of course, now you could, depending on what you actually want to train, if it is a 2-hour marathon, or it is a 10-minute sprint, or a 10-minute run, or it is just a 200-meter sprint. Imagine Usain Bolt, for example, trying at a young age to implement something like this, and then running the 10 meters or the 20 meters, and then every time he reached a heart rate, it was basically somewhat of a failure. But of course it is somewhat differently, because the heart rate doesn't really max out that much, because Usain Bolt in a 10-meter sprint doesn't rely on heart rate that much, on the heart actually needing to pump, because it is much more reliant on the energy stores that are available basically without the heart again resupplying the muscles with oxygen, because it actually is way too fast of an energy supply, of an energy demand to actually get the energy to run the 10 meters. In the end, I took the RS100 and I basically threw it into a drawer, and this is where it stayed for many years until I finally sold it. Then I didn't really have a watch anymore, and I also switched to tracking on my phone, because my phone back then in 2012 or 2013 already had GPS tracking, and it also was very small, so I could track at least my pace, which turned out to be a far better incentive compared to a constant fixed heart rate zone that didn't actually allow me to do any improvements, because at any given day, if my heart rate maxed out, I just couldn't do anything. So it also made me feel more in control once I began to track my routes, my runs, with something that actually incentivized me to run faster.